Lesson 6. A Walk Through the Fire. A.D. Smith. Introduction. Alan D. Smith, essayist, fictionist and broadcaster, was sergeant-turned-writer. During his service as a sergeant in the British Army in India, he encountered exciting experiences. These experiences provided him with enough material for his stories and articles. Contents. Introduction. A Walk Through the Fire is a radio broadcast talk by Alan D. Smith. This article gives an account of the spectacular feats witnessed by him while he served as a sergeant in the British Army in India. An encounter with an elderly Indian. One day Mr. Smith was driving back to the camp after a visit to Sikandarabad. On the way he saw two shadowy figures disappear and an elderly Indian lying with a blood-stained face. With his pocket handkerchief, Mr. Smith cleaned the blood from his face. The Indian told the author that he had not suffered greatly at tried hands of his assailants, two Anglo-Indian youths, because, knowing that Mr. Smith would come to his rescue, he had covered his face and pretended to be unconscious. When asked how he had known of the author coming to his rescue, he replied that some things were known to all but others only to a few. The author gave him lift in his truck to his place. The Indian promised to return the handkerchief during the next meeting and disappeared without the author's knowledge. The first feat of Professor Rao. A few weeks later, Mr. Smith had the opportunity to witness the amazing feats performed by Professor Rao and his Indian troupe. The first feat of the professor was an amazing performance. The professor held a 12-foot-long iron bar against his throat. 12 volunteers were arranged, 6 on either side to hold the bar. On a signal from the professor, they began to push with all their strength, and the iron bar was bent into a U-shape around his neck. The closing act of the professor. The professor's closing act was unforgettable. The professor lay down under a 5-ton truck with men in it. An old railway sleeper was placed alongside his chest. The truck was then driven quickly forwards across the professor's chest. Firewalking by an Indian. An Indian splashed water over his bare feet and walked to and fro over the red-hot coals in a trench. Not a single blister was to be seen. It was an incredible spectacle. The author knelt down to have a close look at the feat. The Indian firewalker thrust a handkerchief into the author's hand. It was then that the author recognized him. Mr. Smith's Walk Through the Fire. Mr. Smith volunteered to walk with the firewalker across the fire trench. The Indian firewalker splashed water over Mr. Smith's feet. Mr. Smith was asked to put aside his fear, close his eyes, and imagine walking a country lane with green fields on either side of him. He did as instructed. He walked along with the Indian over the red-hot coals and back to the starting point. Mr. Smith's feet were unburnt. When everyone came crowding him to inspect his feet, he lost sight of the Indian firewalker. He failed in his attempt to trace him the following day. Conclusion. A.D. Smith's chance encounter with an elderly Indian, his rescue of him from two Anglo-Indian assailants, his subsequent meeting with him, his witnessing the Indian walking through the fire, and of his witnessing Professor Rao's amazing and incredible feats provided him with the material for their broadcast talk. Summary. Mr. Smith, a sergeant in the British Army in India, on his way back to the camp, rescued an elderly Indian from two Anglo-Indian youths. With his pocket handkerchief he cleaned the blood from the Indian's face and gave him lift in his truck to his place. The Indian promised to return the handkerchief during the next meeting and disappeared without the author's knowledge. A few months later, Mr. Smith had the opportunity to witness the amazing feats performed by Professor Rao and his troop. 12 volunteers, 6 on either side, pushed a 12-foot-long iron bar against his throat, and the iron bar was bent into a U-shape around his neck. The professor's closing act was unforgettable. A 5-ton truck with men in it was driven over an old railway sleeper placed alongside his chest. Mr. Smith then saw an incredible spectacle. An Indian splashed water over his bare feet and walked to and fro over the red-hot coals in a trench. Not a single blister was to be seen. Mr. Smith recognized the Indian when the latter thrust a handkerchief into his hand. Mr. Smith also had water splashed over his feet and walked with the Indian fire walker over the red-hot coals. Mr. Smith's feet were unhurt. In the melee that followed, he lost sight of the Indian. Supplementary materials. Describe the author's recognition of the Indian fire walker. Once, the author had saved an elderly Indian from two Anglo-Indian assailants. With his pocket handkerchief, he cleaned the blood from the old Indian's face and even gave him a lift in the truck. On reaching his destination, the old Indian thanked the author and promised to return his handkerchief during their next meeting. A few weeks later, the author witnessed the old man walk through the fire. As he knelt down to look at the Indian's unburned feet, he felt a handkerchief thrust into his hand. It was then that he recognized the fire walker. Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, please like, subscribe and share.